Good afternoon. My name is Michael Glinter. I have 17 years in the recruiting and staffing business, as well as I'm the author of Branding Your Job Search. I'm here today because I want to talk to you about one of the most common complaints that I get every week. That complaint is, why do I not get a call back or an email? So I want to walk you through, as job seekers, some of the challenges that we face as recruiters as well as hiring authorities on what we see on a day-to-day basis. First, let's talk about what you're sending. Just send your resume. Plain and simple. The most common issue that I see is many people think that if they attach 20 different documents, examples of their work, cover letters, I've even had some people send me their passport. At the end of the day, there's only one thing that a hiring manager and a recruiter is interested in, and that's your credentials, your CV, your resume, and that's the one thing that you should be sending. Anytime you're first introducing yourself to someone, just send a resume, not even a cover letter, because quite frankly, in 17 and a half years, I've never read a cover letter. And don't put your references up front. Wait until they ask. Because the first thing that the people want to see is what your credentials are. Now let's talk about credentials. Because I will tell you, 95% of the people that I don't call or I don't respond to, it's not because they're not necessarily qualified. It's what they put on paper that's the problem. First, let's talk about formatting. The introduction of the internet and email has given us the luxury of being able to send off our resume to anybody we want within seconds. The problem is that many of us oftentimes don't really look at what we're sending. As the hiring manager, when I see a resume come through, I don't just look for content, I look for professionalism. I look for a clear and concise message. And a lot of the resumes that I get, they're either not formatted well, they don't present well, they're in text form. Sometimes I can't even open them. I love it when somebody sends me a Dropbox that's private and I have to ask them for a password. The worst thing you can do is make it harder for the person on the other end to understand who you are and what you're all about. So how do you go about fixing it? Well, go online. Check to see what resumes are supposed to look like. Have other people critique your resumes. Or go to a professional like me and say, listen, I need your help. I'm not getting any callbacks and I don't know what to do. My favorite story is the guy that called me up and said that he had not gotten a call back in over 6 months. And he wanted to know what he was doing wrong. I looked at his resume and I quite frankly said, it's your resume. It's just terrible. He hired me. I fixed his resume up, made it look pristine perfect. 72 hours later, I had him in a job, secured, finalized, flew him out the next day, interviewed him, and hired him on the spot. Why? Because his initial resume that he was presenting to people just wasn't cutting it. Now let's talk about content. Resumes should never be more than 2 pages. The only people allowed to have a resume more than 2 pages is somebody that has a PhD, somebody that has 25 years in IT, or someone who's an MD. If you don't have those 3 things, you shouldn't have more than a 2-page resume. Now, I will dispel the wives' tale that you should only have a 1-page resume, because I completely disagree. If you have over 7 to 10 years of experience, or even over 5, and have done a lot to drive profitability in your companies, it's okay to have 2 pages. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that they see the value in the content of what you're presenting. Next, let's talk about what's on the resume. First, your degree, if you have one, needs to be clear and it should be present. I love it when people put that they have a degree, but they don't say whether or not they have a bachelor's degree, an MBA, an associate's. It leaves people guessing. The other thing that's oftentimes a complete mistake is people don't put value on their resume. Do you know how many times I've looked at a resume and a guy has 20 years of management experience, but nowhere on his resume does he talk about how many people he's managed, or what his budget was, or what kind of profitability he drove in his companies? Financial value is what companies look for. They look for how you, as a candidate, are going to affect the bottom line. They look for how you're going to drive change. And if your resume is just a generic job description, then they're not going to pick you out of the bunch because you're not standing out. Now, the complaint that I get a lot is they send their resume and they never get a call back. And their resume is not that bad. Well, I'll tell you, when it comes to recruiters, we don't generally post all the details of what our client's looking for, primarily because of confidentiality reasons. We don't want candidates going around us or trying to contact our clients. So a lot of times we will put out generic descriptions. Well, the downside of doing that is you don't know, but we know what our client really wants. So let's say I have a client that's looking for corrugated box experience. I may not necessarily put that in the job description, but when you send me your resume back and you don't have it, then I move on. That's the downside, unfortunately. And I can tell you, there's a good reason for this. Just yesterday, I had a guy who would not give me his resume. He wanted to know who my client was. I told him I couldn't tell him who my client was without even a resume from him. He proceeded to say that, well, there's only one company in that location. I'm just going to go apply on my own. This is why recruiters are forced to keeping things confidential, because people don't have respect. So at the end of the day, understand, when you send your resume in for a job, especially one that's being done by a recruiter, you may not have all the details that's necessary to truly evaluate whether or not you're a fit or not. And we may not feel you are. But just know that just because you're not a fit for one of our current jobs doesn't mean you're not a fit for a future job. The biggest reason why people don't get callbacks, other than the way their resume is presented, is that they don't meet the qualifications of the job. How about somebody who wants to be a plant manager and he's never been more than a supervisor? Or how about somebody that wants to be a CPA or chief financial officer, but they've never been more than a payroll clerk? If you apply for a job that you know is beyond your reach, then what's the chances you're going to get a call back? I also will caution you that oftentimes companies will not hire someone up into a job. So if somebody's looking for a manager, oftentimes they're looking for someone with management experience. It's very hard for them to justify hiring somebody that doesn't have the experience because they have to turn down all the internal people that want the job as well. And if they turn down someone internal that they know, for someone they don't know that doesn't have the experience, then they're going to have a serious problem. The most important thing to remember when you're putting a resume in front of somebody is how would the person on the other end think when they see it. I can tell you that most people don't know how to write a good resume. Most people don't understand what the values are. And most people don't get it. There's so many tools online, so many places you can go to get advice, so many types of people you could hire. There's so many resources. I would encourage you, if you're sending out resume after resume and you're not getting a response, you need to either research it, figure out what you're doing wrong, or hire somebody to make your resume better. At the end of the day, if you could send out one resume and get a job versus 100 and get no response, isn't it worth it? Please feel free to check in with me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or you can go to my website, michaelglinter.com. I will be here every week to give you great advice and tips on recruiting, staffing, and managerial success. Have a great Friday.